What if all plants vanished for 365 days? Your prologue: the thin, green skin. We were wrong about our planet. We believed its foundation was rock, its energy was the sun, and its defining feature was water. We were wrong. The true foundation of Earth was not stone, but a leaf. Its energy was not just the sun's light, but that light captured and processed. Its defining feature was a single, molecule-thin layer of chlorophyll, a fragile green skin draped over the sterile rock and salt water. This skin was not passive. It was the planet's life support system. It was a chemical engine that regulated the sky, breathing in our poison and breathing out our air. It was a geological engine that built our soil and a hydrological pump that managed our rain. It was the anchor that held our world together against the chaos of wind and water. We knew that a 30-day absence of this system would be a catastrophe, a fight for canned goods in the dark. A 365-day absence was an execution. This is not a story of survival. This is a story of deconstruction. It is the chronicle of what happens when the anchor is cut, the engine is stopped, and the thin green skin is flayed from the bone. This is the autopsy of a living world. This is the chronicle of the barren year. Part 1. The Fast Death, Months 1, 3. Chapter 1. Day 0. The Erasure. It happened not as a sound, but as its absolute absence. At 11:04 Coordinated Universal Time, the planet's primary operating system shut down. There was no warning, no meteor, no blast, no final season. It was simply an edit, a universal delete command executed on every strand of phytoplankton, every blade of grass, every ancient redwood. A botanist at Kew Gardens in London, tending to a critically endangered orchid, watched it vanish from the pot, leaving only sterile soil. A satellite analyst at NASA, monitoring Amazon deforestation, watched the entire basin, the world's lung, switch from vibrant green to a flat, dead brown on his data feed. The signal didn't die, it flatlined. And then came the silence. The great silence. The world, which had always hummed with the sound of leaves brushing against leaves, was now as quiet as the moon. On the world's stock exchanges, the panic was not just financial, it was existential. Within 1 hour, all agricultural futures, corn, wheat, soy, rice, evaporated. They did not crash to zero. They ceased to be a concept. You cannot trade what no longer exists. By sunset, humanity understood. This was not a blight. This was not a winter. The bedrock of civilization, the 10,000-year-old invention of agriculture, was over. People stared out their windows at the sudden, naked topography. They saw the hills, the mud, the rock, stripped bare. The planet felt alien, hostile. The panic of the 30-day event had been about, what will we eat tomorrow? This new, deeper horror was different. It was the sudden cold realization that tomorrow might not even have air. It was the terror of understanding that the stage we performed our lives on was not just scenery. It was alive, and we had just watched it die. Chapter 2. Month 1. The Great Herbivore Extinction. The true sound of the apocalypse was not a bang. It was a lowing. In the first month of the barren year, humanity was confronted with a reality it had conveniently ignored. Our 10,000-year-old civilization was built on a foundation of domesticated animals, and those animals were now starving. The 1.5 billion cattle, 3 billion sheep and goats, and 24 billion chickens on Earth had only days of stored feed. When that ran out, the sound began. It was a global chorus of panicked, starving animals. This was not the gentle moo of a pasture. It was the guttural scream of a creature dying of hunger. Humans, locked in their homes processing the initial shock, now had to listen to the sound of the world dying just outside their windows. The dying was not clean. It was a logistical nightmare of biomass. In India, 300 million sacred cattle, now ownerless and starving, wandered the highways before collapsing. In the American Midwest, vast feedlots became open-air tombs, the stench of ammonia and hydrogen sulfide from the decomposing bodies so potent it drove away the few remaining humans. The wild animals died more quietly, but just as completely. In Africa, the great migration of wildebeest walked into a Serengeti that was not green, but a dusty, brown pan. They didn't stop. They just walked until they fell. Elephants, requiring hundreds of pounds of vegetation a day, were among the first to die, their great bodies slumping against the skeletons of the trees they once ate. By day 30, the fast death of the grazers was complete. The planet was a graveyard. The air, no longer filtered by the fresh, living scent of chlorophyll, was now a global miasma of decay. The foundation of the entire animal kingdom, the crucial first link in the food chain, was gone. Chapter 3. Month 2. The Canned Food Wars and the Carnivore Collapse. For the planet's predators, Month 1 had been a grotesque, temporary paradise. The carnivores, the lions, wolves, tigers, and jackals, found themselves in a world overflowing with dead and dying prey. They feasted. But the feast was a trap. The rotting meat was riddled with botulism and bacteria. The predators that didn't die of food poisoning soon found the buffet running out. By month 2, the carnivores were starving, just as the herbivores had before them. They turned on each other with savage desperation, but their fate was sealed. They were just a biological afterthought, a secondary extinction event. For humanity, month 2 was when the buffer of civilization ran out. The canned goods, the frozen dinners, the bags of pasta and rice. This was the only currency that mattered. The fight for these calories began. It was not a war between nations. Nations no longer existed. It was a war of proximity. Street by street, warehouse by warehouse. It was called the Canned Food War. A Costco distribution center, with its fortress-like walls and pallets of processed food, became more valuable than Fort Knox. Groups of survivors, often organized around former military or police units, seized these strongholds. The rest of the population, those trapped in cities with only a few days of pantry supplies, faced a simple choice: starve or fight. Society dissolved into a brutal, feral hierarchy. A 10-year-old can of Spam became an object worth killing for. The survivors were not the good or the smart. They were simply the most violent, the most organized, or the most hidden. By the end of month 2, the human population was in freefall. The great social experiment was over, reduced to its primal beginnings, the hunt for calories. Chapter 4. Month 3. The Dead Ocean. The land was silent. The cities were dark. But the greatest, slowest death was happening in the deep. Many survivors, particularly on islands or coastlines, had looked to the sea as their salvation. The sea had always provided. This was their final, fatal miscalculation. The marine food web is simpler and therefore more fragile than its terrestrial counterpart. It is based almost entirely on one thing: phytoplankton. These microscopic green engines were erased on day 0, just like the redwoods. In month 1, the krill, trillions of tiny crustaceans that feed on phytoplankton, starved to death. The sea became eerily, unnaturally clear. In month 2, the creatures that eat the krill died. The sardines, the herring, the anchovies, the great baleen whales, filtering tons of empty water, died of starvation, their 100-ton bodies sinking into the abyss. In month 3, the final cascade occurred. The predators, the tuna, the sharks, the dolphins, the seals. With no smaller fish to hunt, they turned on each other and then succumbed. The complex, vibrant ecosystems of the coral reefs, already colorless from the loss of their symbiotic algae, were now just silent, skeletal cities populated by bacteria. By day 90, the fast death was complete. The oceans were no longer a source of life. They were a sterile chemical tomb. And a new, slower horror was just beginning. The ocean, which had absorbed 30% of our carbon dioxide, had lost its biological pump. With nothing living to process it, the CO2 being absorbed from the atmosphere began to fundamentally change the water. The great buffer was gone. The sea was becoming acid. Part 2. The Slow Death, Months 4-9. Chapter 5. Month 4. The Fungal Dynasty. The fast death was over. The screams had faded, the herds had fallen, and the great predators were gone. Now, in the 4th month, the planetary funeral began. The world, stripped bare of all green, was now a feast for a different kind of life. With trillions of tons of dead biomass, animal and plant, lying exposed, the true rulers of decomposition emerged. This was not the age of mammals, birds, or reptiles. This was the age of the fungi. In the damp, dark places of the world, mycelial networks exploded. They were the planet's undertakers, and business was booming. Forests of dead, bare trees were suddenly draped in vast, velvety shrouds of white and gray mold. The ground, soaked by rains that were no longer slowed by leaves, became a tapestry of fuzzy, alien growth. Entire cities were softened at the edges, their concrete and steel becoming substrates for vibrant, grotesque blooms of orange and black fungi. For the few human survivors, this was a new, suffocating terror. The air became thick with spores. Breathing without a filter meant a slow, agonizing death as fungal infections colonized the lungs. The smell of ammonia and rot from month 2 was replaced by a deep, earthy, musty odor, the smell of a billion things being digested at once. This fungal dynasty was efficient. As it consumed the dead world, it released the results of its digestion, a massive, planetary-scale exhalation of carbon dioxide and methane. The planet was now not only dead, it was actively rotting, and this rot was poisoning the sky. Chapter 6. Month 6. Planet of Dust. The fungi were eating the world, and the wind was taking what was left. In the 6 millennia of human agriculture, we had one silent, constant ally: plant roots. They were the biological netting that held our fertile topsoil, the thin, precious skin of civilization, to the rock beneath. By month 6, that netting was gone. The soil, now just dry, sterile dirt, was unbound. And the wind came. It was no longer the wind we knew. It was not a breeze or a gale. It was a constant, planetary-scale abrasive force. With no leaves, no grass, and no forest to break its flow, the wind circled the globe unimpeded. It picked up the topsoil of the Great Plains of North America, the steppes of Asia, the pampas of South America, and the farmlands of Europe, and hurled it into the sky. This was the Great Stripping. The sky turned a permanent, opaque brown. The sun was not a yellow disk. It was a dim, reddish smudge, barely visible. Day was a dim, howling, brown darkness. For survivors, this was a geological torture. The dust was not just dust, it was a grinding powder that destroyed any moving part. It buried shelters, contaminated the last remaining water sources by choking rivers with silt, and scoured the paint from abandoned cars. This was a Dust Bowl event on a scale that encompassed the entire planet. In the span of a single season, the accumulated fertility of millennia was stripped from the continents and blown into the dying oceans. The planet was being skinned down to the bedrock. Whatever returned on day 366 would not find a world waiting to be reborn. It would find a barren, sterile rock. Chapter 7. Month 7. The Treacherous Sky. The oxygen reservoir was still vast. The remaining humans would not suffocate. They would be poisoned first. The fungal dynasty of month 4 and the uncontrolled decomposition of trillions of tons of biomass had pumped the atmosphere full of methane, CH4, and carbon dioxide, CO2. Simultaneously, the dead ocean, Chapter 4, had lost its ability to absorb this carbon. The sky was now a one-way trap, and then came the heat. The global dust cloud from month 6, which had initially dimmed the sun, was now acting as a perfect insulating blanket. The heat from the planet's core and any sunlight that did penetrate was trapped. The world began to cook. Survivors in their bunkers watched the external temperature gauges climb to insane levels. The air itself became toxic. CO2 levels, climbing past 2,000 ppm, then 5,000 ppm, brought on headaches, confusion, and eventually, for anyone exposed, death. This was a runaway greenhouse effect, not on the scale of centuries, but in a matter of weeks. The weather became a form of psychosis. The atmosphere, supercharged with dust, heat, and static electricity, unleashed dry lightning storms of unimaginable violence. With no trees to ground the strikes, the lightning tore across the barren rock, igniting fires in the ruins of dead cities. The sky, once our blue protector, had become a hot, toxic, electrified prison. Chapter 8. Month 8. The Acid Bath. The ocean had tried to help. Even in its death, it obeyed the laws of chemistry. As the CO2 levels in the atmosphere, Chapter 7, reached catastrophic highs, the ocean surface continued to absorb it, desperately trying to find equilibrium. But without the biological pump, without the phytoplankton and krill to take that carbon and sink it to the deep, the CO2 simply saturated the surface water, forming immense quantities of carbonic acid. The pH of the ocean plummeted. It was no longer a dead ocean. It was an acid bath. This was the Great Dissolving. The trillions of skeletons of the creatures that had died in month 3, the coral reefs, the krill husks, the mollusk shells, began to fizzle and dissolve. The calcium carbonate structures that had formed the basis of marine life for 500 million years were chemically erased. For any coastal survivors, the sea became a new terror. The fog that rolled in was not water vapor. It was a caustic mist of sulfuric and carbonic acid that burned the lungs and corroded metal. The smell of the sea was no longer salt and life. It was the sharp metallic tang of a battery terminal. The oceans had become a sterile, corrosive fluid that would take millions of years to neutralize. The planet had not only lost its biological engine, it had now lost its chemical battery. Part 3. The Heirs of the Brown Earth, Months 9, 12, and Beyond. Chapter 9. Month 9. The Last Sanctuaries. The surface of Earth was no longer compatible with human life. The air was toxic, the ground was sterile dust, and the seas were acid. Who was left? Only those who had divorced themselves from the planet entirely. The narrative of humanity splintered into 3 tiny, claustrophobic stories. 1. The View from Above, the ISS. The 6 astronauts aboard the International Space Station. They were the only humans to witness the full, terrible transformation. They watched the green marble turn brown, then gray with fungi, then an opaque, swirling tan. They watched the lightning storms, Chapter 7, rage across the dark side of the planet. They were the safest and the most doomed. Their last resupply was 10 months ago. Their oxygen scrubbers were failing. They were the eyes of humanity, floating in a tomb, watching their home become an alien world. 2. The deep bunkers, the billionaires. The prepper bunkers, built for nuclear war, had activated. In facilities beneath New Zealand, Kansas, and the Swiss Alps, the ultra-wealthy were sealed in. They had geothermal power, hydroponics, which failed as they had no seeds for the staple crops, and vast stores of food. Their sensors told them the outside air was 8,000 ppm CO2 with 20% methane. They were safe, but they understood a new kind of prison. The door could never be opened again. They were not survivors. They were a self-curated museum exhibit of a species that had already gone extinct. 3. The Ice Fortress, the Scientists. At the Amundsen Scott South Pole Station, 40 scientists and engineers were trapped. Their isolated, frozen continent had protected them from the worst of the decay and the dust, but their final supply plane was 11 months overdue. They were the smartest, most capable survivors on the planet, and all they could do was document the end. They turned their atmospheric sensors, once used to study climate change, into the planet's death monitors, tracking the final fatal spike of the world's CO2. They were the species' official eulogists. Chapter 10. Month 12. The New Planet. The world had once been defined by life. Now it was defined by raw chemistry and physics. On day 364, the eve of the theoretical return, Earth was fully an alien planet, a portrait of this new world. The sky was no longer blue. It was a permanent, sickly yellow-brown, choked with dust, from Chapter 6, and a thin haze of sulfuric acid, from the ocean in Chapter 8. The air pressure had risen significantly from the immense CO2 and methane. The global mean surface temperature was up by 20 degrees C. At the equator, the acid oceans were simmering. At the poles, the last ice fortresses were melting. The continents were scoured. The wind had taken all the soil. Only bedrock and dunes of grit remained. Human cities were almost entirely buried under toxic dust. Nothing lived on the surface, but deep underground, in sheltered aquifers and around hydrothermal vents at the bottom of the ocean, single-celled life, bacteria and archaea, persisted. They were the true heirs, waiting millions of years for another chance. On the final night from the ISS, the remaining 2 astronauts looked down. They saw no city lights. They saw only the massive, dry lightning storms, Chapter 7, flashing beneath the dust clouds and raging red auroras, caused not by the sun, but by the ionized atmosphere itself, dancing wildly at both poles. Earth was no longer the blue planet. It was the angry brown sphere. Chapter 11. Day 366. The Impossible Return. Just as they had vanished, they returned. At 11:04 UTC, the restoration event occurred. Trees, grasses, moss, and phytoplankton winked back into existence, but they did not return to the world they had left. They returned to the hell planet their absence had created. Most died instantly. Rainforests, programmed to transpire, appeared on dry rock and superheated air. They desiccated and died in hours. Phytoplankton appeared in the acid bath, Chapter 8. Their cell membranes dissolved on contact. The return was not a rebirth. It was a rejection. The new environment rejected the old life. Some, however, held on. The hardiest of the hardy, weeds, lichens, moss, began a desperate fight. They clung to bare rock in a toxic sky. But they began to photosynthesize. For the first time in a year, free oxygen was released. For the first time in a year, CO2 was being drawn down. But the real tragedy was elsewhere. The plants had returned, but their partners had not. All pollinators, bees, butterflies, hummingbirds, were extinct. All seed dispersers, birds, mammals, were extinct. Most of the nitrogen-fixing bacteria in the now-gone soil were extinct. Apple trees might bloom, but they would never bear fruit. Pine trees might create seeds, but no squirrel would carry them. Every complex support system was erased. The plants had returned, but they returned to a silent, lonely world. Chapter 12. The 365-Day Legacy. The planet had been rebooted, but this was not a system restore. This was a hard drive format, wiping everything except the most basic operating files. The bunkers, Chapter 9, never opened. External sensors showed the air would remain toxic for decades, and it would take centuries for the slow, lonely photosynthesis of moss and weeds to re-regulate the atmosphere. The ISS astronauts were long gone. The Antarctic scientists were gone. Homo sapiens was officially extinct. The legacy of the barren year was a lesson in dependence. We thought we were the story. We were wrong. The real story was the complex symbiosis between rock, air, and chlorophyll. We were merely guests, living off the stability that relationship provided. Earth would recover. Life is a resilient force. In 10 million years, the moss and lichen would build a new soil. In 100 million years, insects would re-evolve, and perhaps a new intelligence would emerge from the bacterial ashes. But our ecosystem, the world of orchids, blue whales, hummingbirds, and oak forests, was gone forever. It had been built over 1 billion years of coevolution, and it was dismantled in 365 days. The thin green skin had been peeled away, and when it grew back, it will be in an entirely new shape. The planet would go on, but the world of man would not.